Will Dallas Cowboys All-Pro receiver CeeDee Lamb miss training camp? All that and more in this episode of the Locked On Cowboys podcast.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. With the NBA and the NHL playoffs now over, the sports aren't sporting like we'd like them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Landon McCool. You can follow him on Twitter at McCoolBCB. And Landon, the Dallas Cowboys never fail to give us stuff to talk about. Even in the dog days of June, we have some Cowboys drama. Let's start with a report from Calvin Watkins of Dallas Morning News that the Cowboys are preparing for CeeDee Lamb to hold out into training camp should he not get a long-term extension. First of all, is that surprising to you at all?
I don't think him holding out is surprising. The Cowboys not doing this deal yet is a little bit surprising. I think, I think that I would have assumed that the deal would have been done right around now. I keep waking up each morning expecting to see something, pop up, and it just hasn't happened yet. I wouldn't be shocked if it got done, first few days of training camp. That wouldn't be surprising either. But if there's nothing done, then no, it shouldn't be terribly surprising that CeeDee Lamb would be holding out of training camp. Although it's obviously not great and certainly not something that you want to last very long. I mean, certainly not for CeeDee's sake, for his financial reasons, but also for the Cowboys' sake. They need CeeDee out there. They need Dak and CeeDee getting, into rhythm. That's the main part of the offense. So let's not mess around with the chemistry there. So I'm not surprised if it happens. Like I said, for all the reasons we mentioned. But if I am surprised that it happens, it's that the contract hasn't got done yet. Not that CeeDee would actually hold out when the contract.
Of their three big contracts they have up, Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb, and Micah Parsons, this one seems the most straightforward. Like the ceiling has already been set with Justin Jefferson, or at least we think what the ceiling is, right? It seems like there's only so much wiggle room here for both sides. Like maybe CeeDee wants to be the highest paid receiver in the league. Maybe, right? So now you're talking about $35.5 million. And maybe the Cowboys feel like he should be paid under Justin Jefferson. So we're talking $33.5 million a year. I mean, I don't understand why if we get to camp and CeeDee Lamb does not have a deal done, I'm going to be pretty disappointed. Like this should be done.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it right. Like even if CeeDee doesn't view that Jefferson deal as something that should be more than him, it's at very least I would say even for CeeDee, who is confident that he's the best receiver in football, it should at least be in striking distance, right? Like it should at least be like, oh, okay, well, the Jefferson got that, then maybe give me $1.5 million more a year or something like that. Like at the very least, we should be like entering in the final phase of the negotiation, right? And that's why I kind of keep thinking that I'm going to wake up each morning and it's going to be done one of these mornings. And that still very much could be the case. And I'm still, let's put it this way. I still put that as the front runner of like likely things that's going to happen here, right? The most likely to me is that we're going to wake up one of these mornings before training camp starts and the deal's going to be done. But it's certainly becoming less and less likely. It certainly felt like when the Jefferson contract dropped that, okay, now we've got some movement. Things should be happening here. Either this is the ceiling to the deal or it's the very close bottom to the deal, right? Like you're close enough that you should be able to kind of hash it out in a couple of days. It's been weeks and we still haven't heard really much of anything along this front. So, it certainly isn't to the point where I'm panicked that the holdout is going to happen. but it certainly seems a lot more likely to happen than it did a week and a half ago when I felt like a contract was imminent.
So the Cowboys are not immune to holdouts. We saw this happen last year with Zach Martin. He held out for about 3 weeks or so before he ultimately got a deal. I just don't understand the point of this. I mean, if CeeDee holds out from training camp, he's going to get fined something like $100,000 a day. Is that going to suddenly make the Cowboys more willing to pay him $35 million a year? Probably not. He's only going to hurt himself. At the same time, I also understand why CeeDee wouldn't want to practice for that long-term deal. So it does feel like the most likely situation is that a contract gets done before camp, maybe 2 practices into camp or whatever. But again, I'm going to be very disappointed in both sides if there's just no movement ahead of camp, or we hear that the sides aren't close to a deal. How could they not be close to a deal when I think everybody knows within $1 million or so what this deal is going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, because of the kind of tenure of where things are right now, people are going to blame the Joneses on this. But I mean, this is a two-way street, really, as much as anything. Like frankly, CeeDee's agents have got no excuse at this point either, because all these deals have been laid out. I mean, even Ayuk, if you wanted to wait for Ayuk, who seemingly is almost the Ayuk situation seems like they could be headed for a divorce more than any of these other situations.
I mean, CeeDee's just outproduced Ayuk every year. So I mean,
and so he shouldn't even necessarily be part of this conversation as much as Jefferson, right? Like, if anything, it should have been Ayuk and then Jefferson, and then CeeDee makes his deal. But I don't know, because of all that, it feels like maybe things have been thrown off. But either way, to me, with the Jefferson deal in place, neither side has got an excuse for why this isn't done. Like, this should be done. Like, it shouldn't be terribly different than what the Jefferson deal is. And no matter how you view it, better or worse, I think it's a standard deviation away above or below this contract. They should be able to get this done. And the fact that they haven't, while this has been sitting on the books for, like I said, almost 3 weeks, it's telling, and it's frustrating.
So let me ask you this. At what point during a holdout would you start to get concerned? Number one, that they're not going to come to a deal. And number two, that maybe the option to trade CeeDee Lamb is on the table, which we'll get to in the next segment. But when are you officially going to start getting worried about this CeeDee Lamb situation?
I mean, I think I officially started getting worried about the Zach Martin situation like 2 weeks into the holdout. I think it depends on what we're talking about worrying, right? Like, I mean, obviously,
what about worried like that that not being at training camp is going to mess up their season, or that it's going to have an impact on their season? Because even Zach Martin talked about last year how missing those 3 weeks of camp kind of messed them up for the whole year.
For sure. I would say by the second week of training camp, the first week of training camp, it's still a little bit of OTA stuff in the sense that it's like, it's mostly install. You're not doing a ton of padded stuff. You're still kind of feeling your way into what practices are like. Second week of training camp is where things start to get a little bit more intense. And I think that's when, you start to actually miss things if you're CeeDee Lamb, right? Like, you're actually missing opportunities to get better with your team in a way that you weren't previous to that. So I would say if there's a holdout and it lasts, through that first kind of, procedural week of training camp, that's when I would say it will start having some effect on CeeDee's regular season play.
All right, let's talk about the outlandish idea. I think you can already tell where I'm going with this, about the Cowboys potentially trading CeeDee Lamb if they cannot agree to a deal. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much that I never want them to stop. It feels weird right now that all I have to watch on TV is Major League Baseball, which has been fine, but I miss all of the other sports. And now with the NBA playoffs done and the NHL playoffs done, we just have fewer and fewer games to watch on TV, and the sports just aren't sporting like the way we'd like them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime that I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all of their customers with a free boost or a bonus daily That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/locked-on and start making the most out of your summer with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Are you having to turn down the volume because of all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all that unnecessary screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Landon, we're going to discuss something here that I absolutely hate. But there has been some buzz on social media that if the Cowboys cannot sign CeeDee Lamb to a long-term deal, they should consider a trade, maybe for a first-round pick and a second-round pick or multiple first-round picks. And if they're truly buying into this idea of a rebuild, save the $35 million, grab draft capital, and move forward. What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, I hate this. Like, even in a rebuild situation, to me, CeeDee Lamb is the piece that you keep, right? Like the piece that you're building around in a lot of ways. So, yeah, I mean, I don't really get this. Like, I'm not balking at the money that CeeDee's asking for. I mean, I think he's the kind of wide receiver that commands the kind of attention that costs this kind of money. He's the kind of producer that can consistently create, and that's why you can feel comfortable paying him a large portion of your salary cap, because he is a large portion of your offense. He's not a guy that needs a second person to create big numbers. He can do it on his own. He can win against double teams. He can win in the slot. He can win outside. He can win inside. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. I mean, you can see the grades that you have up there, but beyond the grades too, I mean, the production that he's been able to produce, that's what's, I think you're paying him for, right? Like sometimes you can have players who play well, but they don't produce, right? And I think production is the kind of bottom line that you're looking for when you're talking about getting paid. CeeDee Lamb is a good player who produces, and he can do so on his own. He can create on his own, and that's how he's able to kind of get this sort of 108 receptions with almost 1,400 yards, while kind of being the sole target on this offense. So,
by the way, those numbers that you just cited, those were only from weeks 6 through 18 last year.
Yeah.
So you take out the first month of the year, and he's 1,400 yards and 11 touchdowns. I mean, CeeDee was, the best receiver in the league by far in the final 3 months of the season. One of our colleagues, Joe Goodberry, who you should follow on Twitter, who
absolutely
covers the Bengals, he's always made this point that if you're a franchise and you draft a player in round one, and that player turns out to be everything you hope for and more, and then you have any concerns about paying that player, you're just a bad franchise and you're a poorly run franchise. And I'm not saying that the Cowboys are that, but they're in danger of that if they consider a CeeDee Lamb trade, right? You drafted CeeDee at pick 17. It was a steal at the time. He's produced 1,000 yards in each of the first 4 seasons. By the end of the year 4, he was the best wide receiver in the NFL, was an all-pro, a unanimous all-pro selection. The thought of trading CeeDee shouldn't even enter their mind at all, right? You have a 25-year-old superstar receiver that can play the slot, they can play in the outside, who's not a headache. You don't have to worry about him, calling out coaches or calling out his quarterback. I think this is ludicrous. Like, you pay CeeDee Lamb and you don't even think twice.
Who are you paying? Like, if not
If it's not
25-year-old, superstar wide receiver who can do it all, who can produce on his own, doesn't need somebody else to create, doesn't need somebody else to produce, is quarterback agnostic, is young, talented, hard worker, doesn't complain, isn't a locker room problem, great example, seems like a good person off the field. Who are you paying? Like, if you're not paying this guy, what's the deal here? So Yeah, look, we can talk about the Micah Parsons stuff. We'll talk about Micah Parsons here in a bit. We can talk about Dak Prescott and whether or not we need to consider playoff success or if we should extend him. I'll listen to all those conversations all you want. Honestly, I'm not going to hear it with CeeDee Lamb. I really am just not. Because like it makes no sense. He's probably the best player on your team.
Probably.
Like, end of sentence. You know what I'm saying? So why would you trade that player away for a guy who's asking for market value in a deal that will be absolutely a steal in 18 months from now? So I just doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Now there have been some other big name receiver trades over the last couple of years. We saw the Chiefs trade Tyreek Hill. We saw the Packers trade Devontae Adams, but all of these situations are different. For example, Devontae Adams was turning 30 and wanted a new deal. And the Packers just weren't that interested in giving him a third contract, right? Again, that is totally different than a CeeDee Lamb who just turned 25 years old wanting his second deal. The Chiefs with Tyreek Hill, they already won their Super Bowl. Tyreek, I think, was turning 29 and wanted a new deal and had some off the field concerns where the Chiefs had to go out and draft a McCall Hardman just because they were afraid of Tyreek Hill. On top of that, they already had Travis Kelce, who was in a lot of ways their de facto number one receiver.
That's right.
The Cowboys don't have that, right? Like they just don't have that other player where if you trade CeeDee Lamb away, it's okay. Hey, we have X player that we can funnel 150 targets to. I think the idea of trading CeeDee Lamb makes no sense if you're in a win now window. It makes no sense if you're in a rebuilding window because, Landon, you know what you're going to have to do if you trade CeeDee Lamb for a first-round pick next year? You're going to have to turn right around and hope that you draft a receiver in the teens that's anywhere close to CeeDee Lamb, and it probably won't happen.
Yeah, I mean, the good news for you there is that you'll probably be so bad without CeeDee Lamb that you won't be drafting in the teens. So, but
well, I'm saying the pick that you might get from another team,
true. So, yeah, I mean, the whole thing is ridiculous. There really is only one player that kind of should stay regardless of what your plan is, and it's CeeDee Lamb, and this conversation about trading him is just, it's ludicrous. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. And you can talk, like I said, you can talk about the other two guys all you want because I think that there's merits there, but to me, he's the top 5 non-quarterback players in the NFL, maybe.
Sure.
With the way he was
he's
playing.
25.
And he's 25.
He just turned 25 in April. Like, what are we doing here?
No, let's not do this, guys. Like, don't give away a guy who's one of the best players in the league, who's young, and he's going to be on a deal that, it seems expensive because not a lot of players are paid like that. But again, look at the way these contracts are going. In no time, this contract is going to be an absolute steal, and you're going to have one of the best players in the league on your team.
And I understand that it's going to get expensive to keep this, this core. But you're keeping this core because they're all pro players and they're really, really young and they're the best players in the NFL. So you can trim some of the fat at other places. Maybe you have to move on from someone like Terrence Steele, maybe a year earlier than you like, or maybe you have to move on from whoever. You keep CeeDee Lamb because that's a pretty rare player.
Well, also, you don't put us through the offseason that we just went through of doing absolutely nothing to then just turn around and trade CeeDee Lamb.
Exactly.
Like even in a rebuild situation, that doesn't make any sense at all. So
there's very few things the Cowboys front office could do that would make me like actively hate them. This would be one of them. Like I just don't see this at all. But let's talk about some other Cowboys drama that we got over the weekend, including Malik Hooker versus Micah Parsons. We will get to that next. The show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Listen, it is really easy to go on social media and compare yourself to another. I mean, you can just sit on your couch all day and you can see how everybody's lives look amazing, but comparison is a thief of joy, and it's easy to envy other people's lives. It might look like they have it all together on Instagram or Facebook or whatever social media platform you're using, but in reality, they probably don't. Therapy can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have, so that you can start living your best life. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's done entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for any reason at no additional charge. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Just visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That is BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We want to give a special shout out to a longtime listener of the show, Stuart from Virginia. Thank you so much for all of your support. And we want to thank you to all of our Locked On Cowboy listeners and all the everydayers for the continued support over the years. But Lana, we've got some big important issues to talk about here, including a Micah Parsons, Malik Hooker beef. I don't know. I was at a theme park on Friday and this popped up. I'm like, oh man, I'm really not looking forward to talking about this. But if you don't know what happened, Malik Hooker was on a podcast over the weekend, and I'm going to read you the quote. Something they were asking him about his feelings on Micah Parsons hosting a podcast during the season. And here is the exact quote from Malik Hooker. "I don't have no problem with it," Hooker said. "My advice for Micah would be to just make sure we're all right, because we're in being where your feet are, because if we're at work and the run game's terrible, but you're doing a podcast every week and you know the run game is terrible, then what are you really caring about? Are you caring about the crowd that's watching your podcast, or are you caring about the success of our team in the Super Bowl that we're trying to reach?" And of course, Micah Parsons responded by saying, "I just wish that you would have said this to me, but instead of on some podcast, you've got my number and you're my locker mate. So you could have said this to me any day. And you do realize that we shoot the podcast on our day off. Why aren't we talking about everyone's preparations and focusing leading up to the game week? I mean, I can point out a lot of other things, but I'm just not." So Landon, should we care about this?
Probably not. I mean, I think, look, I kind of see a little bit of both sides. First of all, I got to go back to you reading this while at a theme park. Was organ grinder music playing when you read it? Because yes. I felt like it,
It's exactly what it was like. I was on this train ride throughout the theme park. I'm just looking at this thing. Not today, please, not today.
Yeah, well, I mean, listen, you're gonna hear that the organ grinder music is gonna be an appropriate soundtrack for all this, right? And look, I think. This is just stuff that comes up with the way media is right now, right? Like, first of all, Hooker was himself on a podcast when he answered this question. Let's all keep that in mind, Second of all, like, again, I think it's tough, because we dissect these things that are said by athletes, off the cuff. They get asked a question, they answer it kind of, as PC as they can. They don't want to cause problems, right? They don't want to cause issues. Malik Hooker's a veteran. He understands that, that he doesn't want to cause issues. I think that Malik Hooker was trying to give an answer that was encouraging to a younger player as opposed to super critical. It didn't feel very critical to me. And especially in the tone of the rest of the conversation that Hooker had about Parsons, he wasn't necessarily like coming after him hardcore about this, I do think that Micah's reaction is, I'm glad he deleted it, because it felt like he has a reason to have some beef. He has some points, to say, and I think that those are legitimate. But I also think that it would have served him better to not said anything, right? It would have served him better to have remained quiet and do what he's prescribing to. That's the ironic thing about both of these guys, is that they're practicing a certain amount of hypocrisy in each thing, right? Hooker's on a podcast complaining about Parsons, potentially being on a podcast and it being distracting. And Parsons is on Twitter saying that this is something that we could have handled privately. And no. I think both of them could have taken a dose of their own medicine and learned a lot from this situation. And I think that that's probably the way that they would handle it moving forward. Teammates are going to have disagreements about, commitment and time thing. I think where this is a problem for Micah Parsons is that he's still now being hoisted by that same petard that he put up, right? The idea of trying to be a leader and trying to be being viewed through those eyes, and now having someone like Hooker compare to the time that he's spending on the podcast and what that means to his preparation for defending the run. I will point out that obviously Hooker specifically pointed out the run game and not the pass game, right? Like in which, Micah is absolutely, tearing it up.
Yeah.
But I also think that, if the run game was, if the fault of the run game was that Micah Parsons was running out of his gaps or didn't know the assignments, that might be one thing, but that's not why we were getting our butts kicked in the run game consistently. So I think that this was a pretty benign comment by Malik Hooker, who was just, trying to say something and be a little bit encouraging to Parsons. And then because of the way information gets disseminated in this world where, the tone is completely stripped out and now it's just the text of what he said. And suddenly, Micah's reacting to it. And I think if everyone had just taken a step back and taken a breath instead of, reacting the way they did, this probably isn't even a conversation.
I think Malik could have done a little bit better job of not making it seem like Parsons is prioritizing the podcast instead of the run game, because he
didn't have to bring up the podcast. That's what it ultimately was, right? Like he just shouldn't have brought that part up. I think what the issue is.
Or if you're trained in the media, you just completely dismiss the question. Just say, "Hey, Mike is always prepared. He does a great job." Blah 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 blah. On the other hand, has this been I don't want to say a weird offseason for Micah, but a loud offseason? I mean, how many in itself, none of these quotes or stories are overly bad, and they're not overly concerning, right? Like, remember when we had the conversation about Parsons's comments on Mike Zimmer? You go back and you watch it, not really that big of a deal. Micah doesn't go to the OTAs, shows up one day, not that whatever, it's OTAs. You start putting all this stuff together, and it's kind of goes back to the report that we had back in January about how it can be sometimes a little frustrating to have Micah Parsons around the building. Not that they don't think he's a great player, not that they don't want to sign him, but maybe he can be a little much at times. And I think you're starting to see some of that play out in the media. But again, I don't think any of this is going to make it where the Cowboys don't want to sign him to an extension.
Yeah, I mean, again, let's also remember that all of this is created inside the structure of the media, right? Like the media started that story. The media is the one asking Hooker the question about Micah Parsons, so part of this is going to be, this is the summer that the media turned on Micah Parsons. I mean, not turned on him, but you know what I'm saying? Like, they spent the first 3 seasons of him looking at him as like this jokester Bo Jackson, right? Like
he's like a Teflon Don a little bit. Dallas,
he's like this incredible, like, he's just fun. He loves football. He's incredible. And then as soon as he starts talking about leadership, that's when the lens kind of flipped for the media. And now they're like, leadership. Well, look what he's doing here. It's this and this and that. And so, I mean, I think there is a certain amount of that is happening. And I think that's kind of explains a little bit of the change of the tone and discussion around Micah Parsons. At the same time, he also did all those things that we're talking about.
But do you know why I have a hard time caring about this? It's because I don't know if Jerry Jones cares about this, because he's always been of the belief that any attention is good attention, right? And if you're talking about me or you're talking about the Cowboys, I'm doing my job. And when that's your owner and your president and your GM, it's hard to get mad at a player for doing a lot of the same stuff, right?
Unless he's upsetting the coaching staff, and that's having
that's different
issues, But I mean, if it isn't, I mean, who knows? Like, it seems like we hear whispers that Mike McCarthy is not thrilled with some of the antics and that sort of thing. But look, again, if this was like your DN2 or your second best linebacker or even your best corner, that's one thing. Like, but this is like a superstar level pass rusher who's an all pro. So I'm willing to look past the stupid stuff because
I mean, it's kind of one of those things. Like if you want a superstar player, you got to put up with some of the superstar tendencies. I mean, I don't want to compare anybody to Lawrence Taylor, but I mean, Lawrence Taylor.
But you don't have to. I mean, Charles Haley is a
Yeah.
guy who was on this team who was playing like a superstar at the time that he got, picked up by the Cowboys.
Yeah.
And he was a huge problem. Now,
different problem,
different kind of thing, and maybe he was pushing guys, in the correct direction in some ways. But I think the idea is Deion Sanders, I mean, for God's sakes, as the coach of Colorado, was sleeping in every single DB meeting he's ever been in. So, there's ways to work around superstars if they're good enough, to be sure.
Yeah, I mean, Deion's a great example. Michael Irvin, I mean, again, all these are different degrees of
types of
problems. Yeah, I mean, a distraction is not even the right word, but like just unnecessary noise, right? Yeah, sure. And it seems like it's been a loud offseason for Micah Parsons. We'll leave it at that.
That's right.
All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen every single day. On tomorrow's show, we're going to answer your Twitter questions, so make sure you send them in to us at Marcus_Mosher, at McCoolBCB. Go download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.